We now enter one of the great topics of the syllabus. This is correction of errors. If you are a qualified ACCA, you are assumed to have certain skills. The fundamental skill, certainly thinking of this level of the exam, the stage of your progression, the fundamental skill is being able to do double entry, sorting out where other people have gone wrong, and as an expert, correcting what they've done. So the topic we have is correction of errors. It all comes from being comfortable about debits and credits. You can see why it's examined all the time. It's because of people's fear of double entry, students, and the fact that if the trial balance doesn't agree, the difference between the debit and the credit side is put into something called a suspense account. What that means is the difference is temporarily suspended, whereupon you come in and say, nope, I don't think it should be in the suspense account. The suspense is a credit, I'm going to debit it, and instead, whatever the suspense value is transferred to the account where it should have gone in the first place. So that's a much feared topic by students, this concept of a suspense account. So there are three great topics really in our syllabus. One is control accounts, which we've recently been doing. The other is correction of errors, also suspense account, all part of the same topic. And the last one, of course, is the bank reconciliation statement, which we're moving on to next. These are three fundamental skills that you must be able to demonstrate. This probably is the most searching. So what I'll do as a special gesture is to slow down and explain it very, very carefully. If you feel that at any stage what I say needs to be reviewed, please stop the tape and start, think about it and then come back to it. Please, feel free to do that. Right, correction of errors, one of the great topics in the syllabus. So this is a new topic, not to be confused with control accounts. There is some connection, of course, but not much. At the end of an accounting period, we extract a trial balance and use this as the basis for preparing the financial statements. So this topic is mainly about trial balances. I'm going to say that, mainly about trial balances. TBs. The following are the main purposes of a trial balance. The first one, account balances are reviewed to check for obscurities. These are odd things that could be missed, slightly obscure. So account balances are reviewed to check for obscurities. The next reason why it's done, reconcile all control account balances with the individual ledgers, the kind of thing we were doing quite recently, our previous topic. So we're going to reconcile. And the third one, of course, ensure that the debits equal the credits. So the examiner might say to you, these are the purposes of the trial balance. Is it A, B, and C? Is it A and B? Is it C? Which one is it? So you've got to read all three of them, and she might even bring in something that you've got to leave out. So do be careful of that. All right, there you are, three items. If there is an imbalance, a suspense account will be created. So can I just say the difference, the imbalance or the difference in the trial balance is suspended temporarily. Suspended temporarily. Therefore, a suspense account may have a debit or a credit balance. Debit or a credit balance. Be careful of that. Errors that will cause a difference in the trial balance are as follows. that will cause a difference. So I might highlight that word will. It will cause a difference. Transposition error, entering figures the wrong way round. What I mean by that is something like this. 15,000 is your intention, but instead of that, it's been entered as 10,500. All I've done is accidentally transferred the 5 here and the 0 there. So what we have to do is, if, let's say, the debit has 15,000, but you put the credit in as 10,500, the difference of 4,500 will mean that the credits are too small. That's what the difference relates to. Okay, so that's the kind of thing we're talking about. Very, very simple if you throw yourself into it and try to understand it before the exam. Single entries, only one side of the transaction has been posted. I see. Only one side. As you know, this is double entry. So if you only put one side in, that's wrong. So let's say if you're going to debit a piece of plant because you bought some plant and you're crediting cash because you paid in cash, say 15,000, you've debited plant but you forgot to credit cash. So clearly the cash account will be overstated because you failed to take away the 15,000. So quite simple if you visualize things in terms of double entry. If you think of it as each transaction as being a debit and a credit, and if you see that either the figures are entered the wrong way round, or one half of it has been entered, if you think in double entry terms, then it's easier to see what the problem was and easier obviously to solve it. Let's move on. Both entries entered into the same side of the ledger account. That's dangerous. So instead of saying debit plant and credit cash, you've said debit plant and debit plant again, both in the same side of the ledger account. You see that? So that, of course, is a disaster, and the suspense account helps you out there. Casting error, is that simply adding errors? That kind of thing. Casting means adding. Literally, as you add up the control account or the individual ledger accounts, whatever it might be, there's some adding error. So usually machines should take care of that, but then you've got to tell the machine what to do. And it's quite possible that if you're doing some typing rather than relying on the machine, it's quite possible that you might add it up wrong. Calculator errors, that kind of thing. These are more where you're doing manual systems, I would imagine. And in the exam, that's half the time you're doing that, assuming that these are manual items. All right, what else can I go for? Although extracting a trial balance proves the above, there are certain errors that a trial balance will not identify. That is a huge word, will not identify. These are as follows. Now, I've seen this examined repeatedly. Okay, very, very important for examination. So what we were saying just now is that the trial balance will show up differences in the first 4 bullet points higher up the page. But now, more intriguingly, the trial balance will not show up these differences. In other words, will not be unbalanced because of these errors. They could be hidden. So here we are. Here's the first one. The error of principle. An entry has been entered, has been made in the wrong financial statement. Classic example, rent, which should go to the income statement, rent paid, instead of, say, a non-current asset. Okay? In other words, it should have been rent, but it's gone in as a non-current asset, or vice versa. So the wrong financial statements. So maybe I could visualize something like that with you. Rent instead of non-current asset. Clearly, rent goes to the income statement, whereas the non-current asset, of course, goes to the SFP, Statement of Financial Position. So do be careful. Errors of omission. A transaction has been missed out completely. Now, if I just go back to the first one for 1 second, if, let's say, you've paid some rent, but accidentally, instead of putting that into the rent account, you put it into a non-current asset account, a piece of plant, for example. So you rented the plant. Instead of debiting rent and crediting cash, you've credited cash, that's correct, but you've debited instead of rent the non-current asset. Do you notice they're both debits? And because the cash is fine, the wrong debit covers up for what the right debit would have been. And so because they are on the wrong account, your profit will be wrong. You see? This is a different item altogether. An error of omission, it's been left out completely. So if I can just go back to my little rent example, instead of saying debit rent and credit cash, you've left both sides of the account out. So you can imagine the trial balance not revealing the omission, because obviously the trial balance will balance with all the other items that are in there, assuming that they are right, of course. So you can see that an error of principle goes to the wrong financial statement eventually, but the trial balance is unaffected. And an error of omission is where the transaction is completely left out. You can see why the trial balance doesn't get affected by this. Here's another one, error of commission. Entering an amount in the wrong account, but in the correct financial statement. Now, what we mean by that is you paid rent, but instead of debiting rent and crediting cash, you've gone and debited printing expenses. So clearly you can see that that is in the wrong account. It should have been rent, but it's gone to printing instead. But of course, it has ended up in the correct financial statement, meaning, of course, the income statement. So here we are. Just to explain that a bit more, e.g., rent for printing, or vice versa. You brought in printing instead of rent, or rent instead of printing, but both are debits, both are expenses to the income statement. So to that extent, the trial balance doesn't show up the difference because they're both debits. Instead of one debit, it's another debit. But of course, the income statement is slightly incorrect. It's not as seriously wrong as, say, some of the earlier items, for example, the first one, the error of principle, but it is still an error because the person in charge of the rent account or the printing account and that kind of thing may be charged with too much. What else is there? Probably the cleverest of the lot is something called compensating errors, where two or more errors cancel each other out. So I'm going to underline that, cancel. This is extremely rare, but it can happen, especially in the exam. So what do we mean by this? Let's say we've debited rent and credited cash with $2,000, because that's the amount we should have paid. But let's say perhaps, even though if I can just go back and look at that again, instead of debiting rent and crediting cash with $2,000, let's say $2,000 is how much it should have been. Instead of that, you've debited rent and credited cash with, say, $1,500. Now, the two sides of the entry are right, but instead of charging $2,000, you've charged $1,500. That may be a better way of me expressing it. Now, a little bit later on, there's another rent item, but this time, of course, even though it should be $2,000, you've gone and debited rent and credited cash with $2,500 by accident. Unaware of the earlier error, you've made another error. Now, you remember the first error, you undercharged. And in the second error, you've overcharged unwittingly without realizing your mistake. But would you agree that if you struck a trial balance, the extra 500 from the second entry compensates for the shortage of 500 in the first entry? So obviously the rent is okay, the cash is okay, everything seems okay, but actually there are two errors built into that. So you notice that the trial balance has got some wonderful purposes. For example, it says there right on top, a few items higher up, account balances are reviewed to check for anything obscure, any little mistakes, anything could be missed. It helps to reconcile control accounts. It ensures debits equal the credits, particularly that last item. So it does have many wonderful uses, the trial balance, especially the debits equal the credits. The suspense account, of course, is used if there are differences, and those differences are caused by the four that we mentioned: transposition, single entries, both entries, casting errors. So that explains why the suspense account is used. But you notice much more nasty is this list of 4 items, where you have things like errors of principal, errors of omission, commission, and compensating errors. That's where the trial balance is still in balance. Can you believe that? The trial balance is still in balance. In other words, the debits equal the credits, yet those errors exist. Now that is deeply troubling for any bookkeeper, for any accountant. The trial balance balances, everything seems fine. Surely there can't be errors in there. But actually, what the examiner is saying is, are you aware that there are 4 classes of error that could exist and be in the trial balance, and yet the trial balance balances? In other words, it's trial balance balances, and you prepare your final accounts, and those balance, because the trial balance balances, there are lots of errors floating about. So clearly what we have to do is to be able to identify these errors before we allow the trial balance to go forward. So I hope I'm making a bit of sense here. It's quite detailed, actually. The trial balance has lots of uses. That's point number 1. The second point, sometimes the trial balance doesn't balance because of errors we've made. That's the first list of 4 bullets. And so to make them agree, we bring in a suspense account. And of course, the third point we're making is the trial balance sometimes balances, yet there are errors. So would you agree in the case of those last 4 items, you will not need a suspense account because the trial balance balances. And so to that extent, even though the suspense account is much feared by students because of the very word and it keeps them in suspense maybe, it's the last list of items, those 4 items, that's what causes the biggest problem, because the trial balance apparently is in balance. And in real life as well, that could be a big, big issue. And that's where your skill, your understanding comes in. So I'm going to take this area very slowly and try to explain through journal entries and so on. Indeed, the very next point as we go along is a few words there on journals. Journals are used for several reasons: to post unique one-off transactions. What else? To transfer items between accounts, of course. You will remember that we came across not long ago the idea of a contra entry where we transfer between the PCA and the RCA, between the payables control and the receivables control, that kind of thing, contra items, for example. There are lots and lots of transfers, of course, transfer between cash and petty cash, between one account and the other. Many, many items. Adjust balances that are incorrect. Yes. And correct items that have been incorrectly posted on the wrong side. So there are lots and lots of reasons for the journal entries. Journals should have a unique number and should be clearly labeled. Now we've seen journal entries many times on this course. Almost in every session we come across the odd journal entry. So here we have journal entries probably at their height in terms of usefulness. So this is example 6. Let's resume. Correct the following errors using journals. That's pretty clear. A sales daybook has been undercast, under-added. Cast means added, under-added by 1,000. So, when the sales daybook is listed individually from the various sales invoices, when you add it up, the total goes to the control account. So notice that the control account is a little bit wrong because it's been under-added by 1,000. But of course the individual accounts are fine because each of the items went to the little T accounts for each customer's account, the credit customer. But the sales daybook is wrong. So that's what's happened. When you did your SDB, your sales daybook, you had, say, 3 items or however many, maybe 33. But when you added it up, it was down by 1,000. So what I need to do now, quite simply, is to sort it out. The total, of course, is debited to the RCA and credited to the sales revenue account. And if it's been underdone, you see this grand total here is debited to the receivables control, trade receivables, and credited to sales revenue, and that has been understated by 1,000. So what do? Just do it again. So it's very, very simple indeed. And so the question goes on. Let's go back maybe and do a little bit of this exercise. So here we are. Example 6. This is correction of errors. Example 6, correction of errors. As I say, one of the great favorites with the examiner, and probably one of the least favorite with students for some reason. Probably a shaky grasp of double entry, quite possibly. So the question says, can we do journals? So let's first of all practice our journal presentation. So perhaps I should have a debit column, a credit column of decent length, so on the debit side, I'll say debit. Credit side, I'll say credit. No problem. Dollar signs, make it look professional. Wherever you can. Clearly, if you're doing a computer-based exam, you can keep all that to the minimum. But just for your own practice before the exam to improve your understanding, let's be really, really clear as to what we're doing. So these are journals. So I'll call this indeed the journal. So, here we are. The first entry. The sales daybook has been under-added by 1,000. So how shall I correct it? I suppose I better debit the trade receivables or receivables control account with 1,000, and I need to credit the sales revenue 1,000. So conventionally, don't worry about the style of the answer. I didn't write these notes. but I want to improve them as we go along wherever I can. They're excellent otherwise, just the odd time. The better convention is to put the debits before the credits. That's what's preferred by the examiner, by real life managers as well. So let's say this is the sales day book. Under added, undercast, comma, now corrected, you see. That thing I've put in, of course, is what we used to call the narrative early on the course. Exactly the same thing. As usual, giving myself plenty of room, I move on to the second item. Consider, by the way, the fact that no suspense account is called for here, because all that's happened is a sales day book, when you added it up, you under-added it. So whatever you had there was debited, of course, to your receivable and credited sales revenue, but that has simply been underdone by 1,000. So what do? Do it again by another 1,000. And you're there. Very, very simple indeed. Be confident. If you know your debits from your credits, just post away happily. Right, let's march on to the next challenge. Be confident. Second point. Inventory purchase for 1,000 has been posted to stationery. Right. So I suppose the 1,000 has simply gone to the wrong account. It's one of those examples of items that do not affect the suspense account. Because after all, purchases is a debit and stationery is a debit. So if you've debited purchases, but you've gone and credited it to stationery, you've gone and debited it to stationery, what you need to do now is to credit it, of course, to cancel that earlier incorrect debit. So you have to visualize what they have done, compare it in your mind to what they should have done, and now, of course, as a third step, you have to do what needs to be done. So you've got to think about what they have done and what happened there in terms of the error. Then you've got to think about what they should have done, and therefore what you need to do to convert what they did do to what they should have done. So it's almost like a three-step approach, though these questions are so simple that you can look at it and sort it out just mentally. But where you do have a suspense account, you might have to take the three steps a bit more cautiously. So as far as I can see here, the inventory purchase for 1,000 has been posted to stationery. So I suppose I better debit what should have been debited in the first place. Debit purchases, much better than inventory, 1,000. And credit, of course, stationery. $1,000. So what I'm going to say to the examiner or my boss who's reviewing my work, incorrectly posted to stationery. So purchases incorrectly posted to the wrong account. Posted to stationery. Just between you and me, it does not have any impact on the suspense account. Trial balance still balances, you see. Caution. Caution. Trial balance still balances, despite the fact that there is an error there. So that's quite a nasty point, actually. But now that you've debited purchases and you've credited stationery, the earlier wrong debit to stationery has been removed, and the debit, of course, has gone to purchases where it should have gone in the first place. Probably slightly better to debit purchases rather than to debit inventory, as the writer of the notes has accidentally done. Right. Right, so there you are. That's the end of that particular exercise. What I'll then need to do is to move on to the last bit, which is, of course, the third journal entry. So here we are. A non-current asset has been purchased for $7,000 on credit but has not been recorded. That's quite straightforward. That's a classic error of omission. It's just been left out completely. So what do I do? If it's been purchased on credit but has not been recorded, I better record it. So I'd imagine I would have to debit the non-current asset and credit some kind of sundry payables. So let's do so. Number 3, eventually, debit non-current asset account and credit sundry payables with 7,000. So the convention is to do the debits before the credits. So what can I say here? Capital asset, an asset that is to be treated as capital expenditure, non-current asset. Capital asset purchased on credit, not for cash, but quite simply omitted entirely. And therefore you can see trial balance still balances despite the error. That's the interesting point. And if I just go back and have a look at the previous one, the trial balance we were saying does balance. Let's try the first one. It says there a sales day book has been under added by 1,000. So clearly, if it's corrected, now corrected, what we could say is the trial balance, even in this case, would have balanced beforehand. Trial balance previously did balance at a lower figure, of course, and now you've just made that figure a bit bigger. That's very, very straightforward indeed. So, the end of example 6, where we've corrected the errors. What I'd like you very much to do is to go back to the previous page, just have a look at those various errors earlier in the chapter. The main purposes of a trial balance, no problem with that. We then have the suspense account causing certain differences. We haven't touched that kind of exercise just yet, but what I am concerned about is showing you that what we've just done demonstrates the third little section there. Although extracting a trial balance proves everything, there are certain errors that a trial balance will not identify. Error of principle, entry been made in the wrong financial statement. What else? Error of omission, if the transaction has been left out completely, we had some of those. Error of commission, rent instead of printing, for example. The purchases to stationery, I suppose, that's a mistake. Compensating errors where 2 or more errors cancel each other out. Extremely rare, but it can happen. Okay, so there you are, example 6, where you have the very subtle class of error where the trial balance, which we are depending on to tell us whether there are errors or not, lets us down. And you have these 4 classes of error that cause the trial balance to be unaffected. Now, what I've seen the examiner examine sometimes is she'll say something like, what do these errors imply? Error of principle. And then she'll use certain words. You've got to look through them and say, yes, I think out of A, B, and C, A is the one that demonstrates, that explains an error of principle best. Or they might give you a circumstance, and you've got to look at it and decide whether, in fact, that is a compensating error or an error of commission, for example. Now, those are quite searching because there'll be hardly any numbers there, just a scenario described. You've got to play with the words, and within a few seconds, within a minute or two, you've got to come to the answer just by looking at that. So you need to be quite. I find those points quite challenging, actually. If I'm not really concentrating, I do run the risk of, possibly getting them wrong. I'm familiar with this, so it's a bit easier for me, but for you, may I say that this is something that most people find quite challenging, and I put that myself in that category. This error of principle, error of omission, error of commission, and compensating errors. Be very, very, very careful with that. So let us look at example number 7. Here we are. It's called Peter. Has the following balances in its trial balance. Peter is the company. At the end of the financial year, might underline the word end, debits and credits. So I notice already there's a slight difference of about 1462. Net debit seems to be a bit heavier. The debit seems heavier by 1462. So you must visualize a trial balance. The debit side has 213,000, etc., and the credit side has only 212. So the debit is more than the credit by 1462. So our task, of course, is to try to get rid of it. The suspense account has been created for the difference. So if your debits are 213 and your credits are 212, I suppose because my debits are bigger than my credits, someone has brought in a suspense account on the credit side so as to build up the credit side to make it equal the debit side. You follow that? So the debit side is heavier at 213,000 and the credit side is only 212. What someone would have done is brought in a suspense to the extent of another credit for the difference so that the trial balance eventually balances. Never forget that a suspense account comes from the word suspended, temporarily suspended, until such time as you, the experts, sort it out. It is something that comes up at F3 and F7. I teach F7 as well, financial reporting. And looking at past exam questions, that's very often a feature in the exam, causes problems. Things like share capital and share premiums and things like that, which I will show you even at F3, because they come up even at F3. So it's a skill that will give you plenty of marks over the next few exams, F3 and F7 in particular. Suspense accounts. So let us now move on to the question there. The bulk of the question. The following errors have been identified by the accountant. After these errors have been corrected, the balance of the suspense account should be removed. Indeed, should be 0. So where it says remove, just say i.e. suspense should equal 0. Should be completely removed. Here we are, 3 quite detailed items. Do be careful. There's a payment for stationery for 440 that's been debited to stationery as 780. Oh dear. So it sounds like the debit to stationery is 340 too much compared to what it should have been. So if your debit is higher by 340, someone credited suspense with 340 to assume that this to make the trial balance balance. So what you've got to assume, of course, is this is the only item that you're dealing with. So it seems like there are 3 stages I need to handle. Stage number 1 is to understand what has happened. For example, stationery has been extra debited by 340. How come? 780 take away from 440. Should have been 440, but 780 entered the book somehow. So one has to assume that the payment went to cash account, credit cash with 440, or credit bank indeed, 440. So that credit has gone to cash or bank, so that's fine, 440. But unfortunately the debit was to stationery as 780. So clearly the debits and the credits don't agree, which is where the suspense account comes in. So step 1 is to understand what happened. Step 2, of course, is to understand the suspense account involvement. And step 3 is to get rid of the suspense account and correct the error. So it's quite a high skill, obviously. But if you approach it in 3 steps, that is the best way. In years gone by, I've written articles about this in the Student Accountant. So they're not available on the website at the moment because it was a little while ago. But when I used to do much more on F3, I now do mostly F7, the suspense account always seemed to have a nice feedback. If I could explain it like I did in those articles, what was done, what did the suspense account do to correct it, what must we do now to get rid of the suspense and get back to what it should have been in the first place. So if you think of it in 3 steps, it makes life a lot easier. All right, let's bring into play, correct the entries and clear the suspense account, it says. So that's the first one. The second one is something about discounts allowed for 1310 have been recorded as a credit. I suppose discount allowed is a debit, isn't it? So discount allowed is a debit, but that has been recorded as a credit. So what I need to do is to double up the figure to get rid of it. So one is to cancel the wrong credit, and of course the other is to set up the debit in the first place, as if the sheet has now been wiped clean. So that's quite a dangerous one. Actually, that could be the worst of the 3. So I'll put a couple of asterisks near there. That's a dangerous item. And the third one, other income of 3742, has only been recorded in the cash book. So that's like a one-sided entry. The cash book is fine. It's gone up by 3742 because you received it, you've debited it to the cash book, but the credit never went anywhere. So the cash book is standing proud with an extra debit, and the cash book, of course, is the debit item in the trial balance, sometimes described as cash and bank. So what's happened here is the cash of debitors, the debit of cash is up, but there is no credit. So the suspense account was credited with 3742, and to correct the suspense account, you've got to get rid of that credit to suspense by debiting it. And of course, you credit other income. Now, all of this I'm going to go through very slowly because this is one of the hardest topics in the syllabus. I'm going to go through it very slowly as we attempt example 7 together. So, don't look at the solution. Let's see if we can write on a blank sheet of paper as we face this kind of exercise ourselves. So let's start another page as we set out example 7 in some style. Nothing to be afraid of. So let's commence example number 7. This is the 7th example in this chapter. So you can see why there's so many examples. It's just the heightened chance of it coming up. Every sitting we have many questions on this area. So this is the use of the feared suspense account to correct errors. Use of the suspense account to correct errors. So I've got to correct the entries and clear the suspense account. So how shall I do that? I suppose I better do these journal entries. So as always, if I can set out these various journal entries, give myself plenty of room to do the 3 entries, debits and credits, that kind of thing. Dollar signs, that kind of thing, no problem. And so we have item 1, 2, 3. Let's try the first one. Now, I might do another page of thinking here, explanation. So I'll abandon the half a page or so for the journal entry, just put that on one side. Here are some additional explanations. It is a harder topic, so I'm going to take a few extra minutes to do this. The first one, a payment for stationery was debited to stationery as 780. So I suppose step 1 is we have debited stationery with a plus 340, too much. The plus indicates the error. Obviously the credit went to cash for 440. So cash credited with 440, stationery debited with 440 plus 340, making obviously 780 in all. And to the extent of 340, that's been over debited. So what then happened was the suspense account, assuming this is the only error, of course, the suspense account is then called into action. So I'll call that step 2, if you like. Suspense account involvement. Because your debit is too much, the suspense account was brought in, was credited to the extent of 340, and that would cancel the extra debit. You see that? The suspense account is credited with the extra 340 because the stationery was debited with 340. So your trial balance now balances. You see that? Therefore, trial balance now balances. So if you've got extra 340 in as a debit, how do I make the two sides agree? I bring in some suspense as a credit so that my debits now equal the credits. The debits now equal the credits. No problem with that. So how do I correct everything? I now go to step 3. Which is where I suppose I should be getting rid of the suspense. If I debit suspense and credit stationery with, say, that figure of 340, that should be my entry. Think about it. The credit to stationery was earlier 340 too much, or shall we say the debit to stationery was 340 too much. By crediting it, I've cancelled it. And of course, the suspense has now been removed. So that 3-step approach might help you. Okay, let's go back and see if we can put that into our final resting place here, where we have a proper journal entry set out. So let's go for it. Debit suspense account with 340, and we're going to credit stationery. Credit stationery. Account 340. So basically, there's an incorrect total being posted, now removed. So incorrect total posted, now stationery reduced, and more importantly, suspense removed. That's the key point, you see. The suspense has now been removed. To that extent, the suspense has been, if you remember, the suspense earlier was a credit balance, but now it's been removed. So in a few minutes, we'll have a look at the suspense account on its own. All right, let's march on to the next challenge, see how we go. So I'll draw a symbolic line to indicate that's the end of that particular item, and we now move on to the next item. So item number 2. Let's have a think about the scenario. Discounts allowed, which is a debit, of 1310 have been recorded as a credit. Oh no! So there's too much of a credit, certainly. So what I need to do is to somehow double it up by bringing in 2620, a debit that's needed to cancel the wrong credit. That kind of thing. So how shall I do that? Maybe I should break and do some thinking in our little special sheet lower down the page, in case that helps. Here we are. So the second item, discounts allowed is a debit usually, but accidentally credited. So there's too much of a credit. Too much credit. So what to allow for, of course, is what happens to our suspense account. So that's like my step 1. Step 2 is, how did the suspense account get involved with all this? The suspense account would have been debited with, you see, because you've recorded a debit as a credit, your credit is too much by 2620. So what someone did was bring in the suspense as a credit the suspense, beg your pardon, as a debit to compensate, of course. So what I need to do now is to get rid of the suspense account. Don't like it. So step 3. I suppose I better debit discount allowed with 2620 and credit that temporarily suspended item called suspense with 2620. Obviously this credit to suspense is cancelling this debit, of course, to cancel. But the debit to discounts allowed, what we mean to do there is one of these, the 1310, the first 1310 cancels the wrong credit, and the other 1310 sets up the correct debit. Did you see that? So that's the second item. So let's go back and throw that in. Debit discounts allowed. $2,620, and credit, of course, suspense. So I'm going to say suspense removed. And I'll also say that one of the 1310 and another 1310, so maybe I'll make that 2620, maybe easier. 1310, 1310. The first 1310 cancels the wrong credit, and this one sets up the correct debit. You see what I mean? So that's the end of that one. And so let's move along to the last entry, drawing a nice line, etc. there. The third entry then, a lot easier, this one. Other income of 3742 has only been recorded in the cash book. So clearly I need to bring in the second half of the entry. So what I might do is to move on to the little explanation section down here. What can I say? It's a one-sided, so cash debit is up, and that's correct, but no credit. That's a problem. That, if you like, is step one. Step two, suspense was brought in, was credited. Suspense was credited to make it balance. And of course, to correct, you have to get rid of the suspense account and put it into where it should have gone in the first place. To correct, you need to debit suspense and credit the other income with the same figure, of course. So let's go back and pop that into our framework, our little journal entry, to make sure it all makes sense. So here we are. I'm going to debit the suspense account 3742 and credit where it should have gone in the first place, other income 3742, and so the suspense is removed and correct entry credited. In all cases, of course, the suspense has been removed. And so our final exercise is to make sure the suspense account does balance. For that, I need to do a little T account as my last step. So where should I do that? Maybe below the explanations, maybe a good place. Here we are, nice big suspense account. You will remember it starts off as a 1462 opening balance. And you remember journal entry 1 had it on this side, 340, something to do with stationery. The second entry was on this side, something to do with discounts allowed, 2620. And the last entry was something to do with other income. and that was 3742. And so if you add that up, it's 4082 on both sides. No closing balance. $4,082 on both sides. And that account is nil. So whenever you have a suspense account, the whole idea is to understand what happened, why it was involved. But that isn't the answer, that's only the second stage.